When the video leaked, everyone thought it was a scandal. A powerful man whispering to a 19-year-old maid. The words caught on camera were damning in their brevity. Too big. Just sit on it and do it. The clip was 20 seconds long, grainy and shaky, filmed through a half-open door. Within an hour, it had spread like wildfire across every platform. TikTok, Twitter, Reddit, every gossip site that fed on humiliation and outrage. The caption read, "Powerful man caught on tape." By 7 o'clock that morning, New York woke to hashtags trending at number one. Too Big Challenge and hashtag Santoro Scandal. News anchors called it the biggest shock of the year. Dominic Santoro, the reclusive figure who controlled half the city's private security operations, the man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike, was now the most exposed person on the planet. Reporters camped outside the iron gates of his Hamptons estate. Investors, the legitimate ones at least, demanded statements. Lawyers scrambled for damage control. And somewhere in the eye of the storm stood Sofia Ramirez, the maid from the video, the girl whose face the tabloids zoomed in on like prey. By noon, paparazzi had found her apartment in Queens. They followed her to the subway station, cameras flashing as if fame were a crime she'd committed. Some shouted questions that cut like glass. Is it true he paid you millions? Do you love him? Did he threaten you? Her phone flooded with messages, half threats, half pity. A cousin she hadn't spoken to in years texted, "Congratulations, rich girl." Another message, anonymous, called her things she couldn't repeat aloud. Sophia locked herself in her small bathroom, trembling, watching her own reflection blur through tears as her name rolled across television screens nationwide. Outside, people argued over her dignity like it was public property, something anyone could claim and dissect. At the same time, in the stone mansion overlooking the Atlantic, Dominic sat in his rehabilitation room, his phone lighting up with notifications he wished he could erase from existence. The same room where the video had been filmed, bright, sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic and leather. The same room where he had been learning to stand again after the attempt on his life that had left him partially paralyzed. His face was pale under the cold fluorescent light, his jaw tight with disbelief. The whisper that had gone viral was never meant for the world. It had been meant for courage, for survival, for the absurd humor two people shared when life became too heavy to bear. Yet the internet had already judged. His phone buzzed again. Rocco, his right hand for 15 years, stood near the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "The lawyers are calling, boss. They want a statement now." Dominic didn't look up. "Tell them to wait. They're saying the whole operation could collapse if this gets worse." "Then let it collapse," Dominic said quietly, his voice carrying that particular edge that made even loyal men hesitate. He stared at the paused frame on his tablet, her face close to his hand resting against the rehabilitation bar. Both of them caught in a moment the world had twisted into something ugly. The internet saw sin, he saw survival. Then a breaking headline flashed across the wall-mounted television. "Investigation underway. Former employees speak out." Fabricated testimonies filled the screen. People claiming they'd seen him manipulate staff, demand obedience, use his power to intimidate. His company's legal team begged him to issue a statement blaming her, to call it manipulation, to paint her as opportunistic. Dominic refused. His silence was interpreted as guilt. Meanwhile, the online world turned Sophia into a meme. Teenagers mocked her body, copying her posture in videos, using filters to exaggerate her curves. The cruelest trend was called the "Sit on It Challenge," where influencers mimicked the phrase with laughter, turning her pain into entertainment. Sophia's agency fired her that afternoon, citing brand risk. By midnight, she was unemployed, publicly shamed, and terrified to leave her apartment. Her younger brother knocked softly on her bedroom door. "Sophia, why are they saying bad things about you?" She pressed her forehead against the door, tears streaming silently. "They just don't know the truth, mijo." Cameras flashed outside her window, hunting for more pain to broadcast. And inside the stone mansion, Dominic Santoro opened his laptop to write a statement, but no words came. Instead, he remembered how it had all started 3 months earlier. The day she first stepped into his life with a mop, a nervous smile, and courage too pure for the world he inhabited. He closed the laptop, leaned back against the cold leather chair, and whispered to himself, maybe the world doesn't deserve to know what really happened. Then he looked up at the security camera in the corner, the same one that had betrayed them, and said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a promise, but I will tell it anyway. The scene froze there, bathed in dim amber light from the desk lamp. His reflection fractured across the dark window. His eyes held not anger, but something heavier, sorrow perhaps, or the quiet fury of a man who'd survived worse betrayals and refused to break. Then the image faded, replaced by text on the screen. 3 months earlier, before the world called him a predator, before she became a symbol of shame, before the internet took their story and burned it for entertainment, there was only a man learning to walk again, and a girl who refused to laugh at his pain. That was how it really began. The morning light in the Hamptons was merciless and white, cutting through the heavy curtains of Dominic Santoro's seaside estate like judgment slicing through stone. For 3 years he had avoided that light, living behind tinted windows and the quiet hum of security systems that monitored every breath, every movement, every threat. The world called him the Phantom Boss because no one had seen him in public since the incident. The night his car was run off the road in what everyone believed was an accident, but he knew was an attempt on his life. A calculated move by rivals who thought his empire could be taken if he was removed from the board. His survival was a miracle, but it came with a brutal price. The surgeons had rebuilt his spine with titanium rods, fused bones that would never bend the same way again. Yet they couldn't restore what he'd lost inside, the sense of being whole, of being invincible. Every movement hurt. Every sound reminded him of screeching metal and the smell of gasoline. In silence, he ran his operations through encrypted calls and trusted intermediaries. Money still obeyed him. Fear still protected him, but his own body would not. He spent mornings with physical therapists who came and went, never lasting more than a week. They whispered about his temper, his refusal to be touched, his cold precision that made even medical professionals uncomfortable. He fired them all without explanation. The latest one had left in tears 2 days ago, muttering that the man had no soul left. Dominic hadn't argued. He wasn't sure she was wrong. His only constant companion was Rocco, the silent shadow who had been by his side since they were teenagers running numbers in Brooklyn. Rocco understood loyalty in a way most men didn't. Not blind, but earned. He also understood when to speak and when to simply stand watch. The estate itself reflected Dominic's world. Stone walls thick enough to muffle secrets, dark wood paneling that swallowed light, and floors that creaked only when he wanted them to. No glass towers, no modern sterility, just old-world strength wrapped in shadows. The business he'd built, Santoro Security, was thriving on paper. Private security, bodyguard services, consulting for corporations that needed problems to disappear quietly. On paper, it was legitimate. Beneath the surface, it was an empire men feared to cross. Yet Dominic Santoro, the man who could make threats vanish with a phone call, couldn't secure his own peace. When Rocco brought a folder of new staffing requests one gray morning, Dominic barely looked up from his coffee. I told you no more live-in staff. Rocco's voice was calm, measured. Boss, we need someone for basic cleaning. The estate's falling apart. Even ghosts need maintenance. Dominic's jaw tightened. Fine. Choose whoever you want. Just no questions, no interviews, no one who'll look at you like you're broken, Rocco finished quietly. Dominic's eyes flicked up, sharp. But he said nothing because Rocco was right. The next morning a girl showed up. Sophia Ramirez, 19 years old, 5'8", with soft dark hair pulled into a messy bun and a uniform that hung awkwardly on her frame as if borrowed from someone else's life. She introduced herself with a nervous smile, standing in the marble foyer like someone who'd walked into the wrong castle. Good morning, Mr. Santoro. I'm from Ocean Clean Services. I'll be quiet, I promise. Dominic glanced at her once from his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. He noted the way she didn't flinch at the sight of him, didn't let her eyes linger on the metal brace visible beneath his shirt. You have the East Wing, he said flatly. Don't touch anything that looks expensive. She glanced around at the oil paintings, the antique furniture, the Persian rugs. That leaves almost nothing, she muttered under her breath. But he heard it, and something in his chest, something he thought was dead, almost laughed. Almost. For days they hardly spoke. She cleaned, moving through the vast rooms with careful efficiency, humming softly to herself. It was a sound that filled the sterile mansion with something unplanned, something human. Dominic ignored it at first, then found himself listening through the walls, the way a blind man listens for proof of life. She didn't ask him questions, didn't stare, didn't pity. She simply worked. One afternoon he heard a crash from the rehabilitation room and moved faster than he had in months, wheeling himself through the hallway with sudden urgency. Sophia was kneeling beside the therapy bars, papers scattered everywhere, her hands trembling as she tried to gather them. "I'm so sorry," she blurted out, not looking up. "I was trying to wipe the mirrors. I didn't see the equipment. I—" "Stop," Dominic said, his voice low but not harsh. She froze, finally meeting his eyes. Hers were wide, flushed with embarrassment. He looked at her face, then at the fallen crutches beside her. Most people flinched when they saw his equipment, or pretended not to notice. She did neither. She simply stood, helped him pick up the papers, and said softly, "Everyone falls, Mr. Santoro. That's why there are floors." The words disarmed him more than any pity ever could. After she left, he sat staring at the mirror, seeing not a feared man or a crippled one, but someone who'd just been spoken to like he was ordinary. That night, he couldn't sleep. He replayed her tone, the absence of judgment, the casual courage in her voice. He found himself checking the security feed, watching her close up the cleaning cart, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone carrying invisible weight. The next morning, when she returned, she found him already waiting in the therapy room. "I'll handle the mirrors," he said without preamble. She smiled slightly, setting down her supplies. "You planning to fire me for honesty?" "I've fired people for less," he replied, but his eyes softened just barely. "You're still here." She handed him a towel. "Good. You missed a spot." For the first time since the attempt on his life, someone had handed him something without fear or calculation. The following week, she became part of his routine, though neither admitted it aloud. She arrived before sunrise, brewed coffee the way he preferred, dark, no sugar, and left a note on the tray that read in neat handwriting, "Good morning, the world's still here." He read it twice every day. The therapist who still came occasionally noticed the change. He was standing longer, holding the bars with steadier hands. One asked if he wanted company during lunch. He shook his head, thinking of the girl humming somewhere down the hall. That evening, as the sun dropped over the Atlantic, Dominic wheeled himself onto the stone terrace, watching waves crash against the rocks below. The salt air stung his lungs, but it felt real. Sophia stepped out with a basket of linens, startled to find him there. She hesitated. "Sir, you should be inside. The wind's cold," he said quietly, eyes still on the horizon. "It's the first time I've felt it in years." The breeze tangled her hair. She smiled faintly. "You're weird, you know that? Men like you don't feel the weather." "Maybe that's why men like me lose touch with reality," he replied, his voice carrying an edge of something almost like humor. She looked at him differently then, not as a boss to fear, but as a man trying to find his place in a body that had betrayed him. Before going back inside, she said over her shoulder, "If you ever need help standing up, just ask." He didn't answer, but later that night, when his back locked mid-session, leaving him stranded and trembling, he remembered her words. The following morning, she found him collapsed near the bars, sweating with pain and frustration. Without hesitation, she knelt, slid her arm under his, and said firmly, "Come on, don't let the floor win." Together, they managed to get him upright, both breathing hard. He whispered through gritted teeth, "You don't have to help me." She smiled, breathless. "Maybe I do." For a moment, neither moved. Their reflections trembled in the mirror. A man built of steel and scars, and a girl made of quiet courage. He looked at her and thought maybe fate had sent her not to clean his house, but to remind him it was still possible to live inside it. And for the first time in 3 years, Dominic Santoro felt something other than rage. He felt hope. The storm rolled in without warning, thick gray clouds swallowing the horizon as rain slammed against the stone walls of the Santoro estate. The wind howled through the old structure, rattling windows and making the ancient house groan like it remembered darker times. Sophia had stayed late, finishing her rounds because the bridge to town was closed due to flooding. The rest of the staff, what little there was, had left hours ago, leaving only her and Dominic inside the enormous mansion that felt less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out. Lightning flashed, illuminating her reflection in the tall windows, bucket in hand, hair damp from the humidity seeping through the cracks. She whispered to herself, "Guess I'm stuck here tonight." Dominic heard her voice echo through the marble hallway and appeared in the doorway of the rehabilitation room, leaning heavily on his cane. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of scar tissue that ran down his chest, a reminder of the night someone had tried to end him. "Power's out in half the county," he said quietly, his voice carrying that particular roughness that came from years of giving orders meant to be obeyed without question. "You can use the guest room." Sophia shook her head. "I'll just stay on the couch. I don't want to." "It wasn't a request," he interrupted, but his tone wasn't harsh, just final. She nodded, understanding that arguing with Dominic Santoro was like arguing with the tide. He returned to his therapy bench, but she noticed how pale he looked, how his hand trembled when he reached for the parallel bars. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cold. "You should rest," she said softly, setting down her bucket. He ignored her, gripping the metal rails with the stubborn pride that had built an empire and survived betrayal. "I rest too much. I need to feel something." The thunder outside cracked so loud the window shook. He tried to take a step, but the floor was slick from a small puddle of rainwater that had leaked through the old door frame. His crutch slid. Sophia lunged forward just as he fell, and the next second they were both on the ground, his weight knocking the breath from her chest. She smelled rain and leather and the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with pain. Her hand was pressed against his shoulder. His face was inches from hers, breath shaky and uneven. "You fall harder than your reputation, Mr. Santoro," she whispered, trying desperately not to laugh despite the absurdity of it all. For a heartbeat, the corners of his mouth twitched. Then he actually laughed, a sound raw and disbelieving, echoing in the empty room like something forgotten, finally remembered. The storm outside howled, but inside the air was strangely quiet. He realized she was still holding on to him, their bodies tangled awkwardly on the cold floor, his chest rising against hers with each labored breath. "You can let go now," he said, but his voice came out softer than he intended. She blinked, awareness flooding back. "Oh, right, sorry." She pushed herself up, then helped him sit, her hands steady and unafraid. His knee was bleeding from the fall, crimson against pale skin. Without thinking, she tore a piece of her cleaning cloth, dipped it into the nearby basin, and knelt to clean the cut. Her touch was gentle but efficient. "I've done this for my brother when he played soccer," she said, focused on the task. "You learn not to be squeamish." "You're not squeamish," he observed, watching her concentration. "I don't have time to be squeamish," she answered simply. "People like me don't get that luxury." He looked at her profile, the determination in her face, the way she spoke without self-pity or performance. When was the last time someone had treated him this way? Without worship, without fear, without expectation? Maybe never. She glanced up, catching him staring. "What?" "You're different than I thought," he said. "Different how?" He hesitated. "You look at me like I'm just a man who fell, not like I'm dangerous," she finished quietly. "Maybe you are, but right now you're also bleeding, and that's what matters." Something shifted in his chest, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long it had fused with his skin. When she finished cleaning the wound, she sat back on her heels. "You should be fine, unless you're secretly made of glass." He smiled faintly. "My body, maybe. My pride, definitely." The power flickered again, throwing the room into shadow. The wind moaned through the cracks of the old stone walls. "You should eat something," she said, standing and offering her hand. He shook his head. "I'm not hungry." "You're lying," she replied. "Powerful men lie about being fine the way poor people lie about being happy." That made him laugh again. deeper this time, surprised by her bluntness. Fine, he said, accepting her hand. Lead the way. They ended up in the kitchen, sitting across from each other at the old wooden table while the storm raged outside. Sophia heated leftover pasta in the microwave and slid the plate to him. He hesitated before taking a bite, as if rediscovering the act of eating in company. She poured herself coffee, watching him from the corner of her eye. So what happened to you? She asked finally, her voice gentle but direct. The accident, he said flatly. My car went off the road. I was lucky. She tilted her head. You call this lucky? He shrugged, the gesture carrying weight. Some people didn't walk away at all. And you? He asked, turning the question on her with the precision of someone used to interrogations. How does a girl like you end up cleaning estates for men like me? She looked down, stirring her coffee slowly. When people look at me, they see my size before they hear my words. It's hard to get a job when every interviewer stares at your body before your resume. Cleaning's honest work, at least. Nobody expects you to be perfect when you're invisible. He studied her the way he used to study threats, searching for truth between the lines, reading what wasn't said aloud. You've been through things, haven't you? He said quietly. Everyone has, she replied. I just don't hide mine behind stone walls. For a long moment they sat in silence, broken only by thunder rolling across the Atlantic. Then he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I can't feel below my waist most days. The doctors say some nerves might recover, but probably not all. I wake up every morning pretending it doesn't matter, but it does. She looked up, startled by the admission. He continued, eyes fixed on his plate. I built my life on control. Now I can't even control my own body. She nodded slowly. So we're both broken, she said softly. Maybe, he replied, or maybe we're just different shapes of whole. That line hung between them, delicate as breath. The rain eased, turning into a steady rhythm like a heartbeat against glass. She smiled faintly. I should probably check the windows before the whole house floods. He watched her leave, her silhouette framed by candlelight Rocco had lit throughout the hall. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like possibility. Later that night, when he lay in bed listening to the storm fade, he could still hear her laughter echoing through the halls, the sound blending with the sea, filling spaces he'd thought were permanently empty. It was absurd how alive it made him feel. He whispered into the dark, maybe to her, maybe to himself. You fall harder than your reputation, Mr. Santoro. And for once, he didn't mind the fall at all. Morning light leaked through the windows like forgiveness after a long night of storm. The rain had passed, leaving behind the scent of salt and renewal. Dominic sat in the rehabilitation room earlier than usual, staring at the parallel bars like an enemy he was learning to respect. His muscles still ached from the fall, from the years of forcing his body to obey commands it no longer understood. Yet something inside him felt different this morning. Not broken, not numb, just aware. When Sophia entered carrying a tray with coffee and something that looked suspiciously like toast, she found him already gripping the bars, trying to stand. She set the tray down quickly. You should wait for me. I can't wait forever, he replied, his voice rough from effort. She crossed the floor, her footsteps soft on the stone, and adjusted the safety strap around his torso with practiced efficiency. He winced when she tightened it. Breathe, she said gently. The body listens better when it knows it's safe. He gave a small, strained laugh. Is that what you tell yourself too? She smiled without answering, her hands steady and sure. He gripped the bars harder, knuckles whitening as he pushed up. An inch, then two. For the first time since the night everything changed, he stood fully upright, not steadily, not gracefully, but standing. She stepped closer instinctively, one hand hovering near his waist, ready to catch him if he fell. His breath caught, pain shooting up his spine like lightning through metal. It's too much, she said, concern flickering across her face. Too big a move. Too big. He forced a shaky grin through the pain. Then maybe I just need to sit on it and do it. Sophia froze mid-breath, startled by the phrasing. Then, as he grimaced and lowered himself back onto the therapy bench, realization dawned. He was talking about the balance ball, the large foam roller he used to stabilize his back during exercises. He wasn't being crude. He was trying to joke through pain. For a moment, the absurdity of it all. This feared man with titanium in his spine making awkward metaphors in a luxury rehabilitation room was too much. She burst out laughing, the sound genuine and unguarded. He looked up at her laughter like a man seeing sunlight after months underground. "What?" he asked, but his eyes held amusement. "That's your motivational quote now?" she teased, still laughing. "Too big. Just sit on it and do it." He chuckled weakly. "Maybe I'll print it on a poster. Inspire millions." "Or traumatize them," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. He smiled fully then, the kind of smile that didn't need an audience, that existed simply because it wanted to. They stayed that way for a while, two people sharing oxygen and awkward joy in a room that had only ever known silence and struggle. Later that day, when she returned to continue cleaning, he asked her to stay during his next session. "The therapist canceled," he explained, though they both knew he'd sent the therapist away on purpose. "You've got steady hands. You'll do fine." "I'm not trained for this," she protested. "I'll teach you," he replied simply, and the way he said it left no room for argument. So she stayed. She learned to strap the brace properly, to measure his steps between the bars, to remind him when to breathe through the pain that painted his face white. It became a ritual. She'd count quietly under her breath. He'd focus on her voice like it was the only thing anchoring him to the present. When his legs shook, she steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. When frustration hit like a wave, she'd say calmly, "You've faced worse things than gravity." One afternoon, he stumbled and caught her arm to keep from falling. Their bodies collided, his chest against her shoulder, her hands instinctively gripping his waist for balance. For a split second, neither moved. His hand gripped her shoulder. Her heart raced against her ribs. The air between them thickened with proximity and something unnamed. "You okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I forgot what okay feels like," he whispered back, still catching his breath. She didn't pull away. "You're allowed to feel again, Dominic." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He met her gaze, something flickering there. Fear, maybe, or longing, or both tangled together. "You make it sound simple," he murmured. "It isn't," she said honestly, "but it's worth it." That night, she stayed later than usual, helping him stretch muscles that had forgotten how to relax. He lay on the mat, and she knelt beside him, counting his slow breaths. The room was dim, just one lamp burning gold against the gray stone walls. "Why do you help me?" he asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Because you keep trying," she said without hesitation. "Most people give up when life gets heavy. You don't." He turned his head to look at her. "And you?" "I've been heavy all my life," she said with a wry smile. "It's what keeps me grounded." He laughed quietly, the sound softer now. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd pity me," he said. "Pity doesn't heal," she replied. "Only honesty does." Her words landed like truth he'd forgotten existed. He closed his eyes, breathing deeper now, guided by her voice counting. In and out, in and out. For the first time since the attempt on his life, his chest loosened. The next morning, Sophia found a note waiting on the cleaning cart. In neat, controlled handwriting, it read, "You don't have to hide from me." She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket, her heart beating faster than logic allowed. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. He practiced walking. She timed his steps. They shared jokes that weren't particularly funny, but made them both laugh anyway. Every time he stood longer, she clapped softly. Every time he stumbled, she said, "So what? The floor's there to catch you." And every time he looked at her, the air in the room changed shape. One evening, after another long session, Dominic sank onto the bench, exhausted. His shirt clung to his back, sweat tracing the scars down his spine. Sophia handed him a towel. "You did better today." "Define better," he said between breaths. "You didn't curse once," she teased. "That's progress." He looked up at her, his dark eyes catching the amber light. "You make me want to keep trying." Her throat tightened. "That's the point." Silence lingered, comfortable, fragile, and achingly new. He broke it with a half smile. "Too big. Just sit on it and do it, he said again, deliberately repeating the phrase that had once made her laugh. This time the words sounded different, not about therapy or pain, but about courage, about choosing to live despite everything. She shook her head, smiling despite herself. That's never going to stop sounding wrong, you know. Maybe that's why it sticks, he replied quietly, because truth never sounds polite. That night, when she left the mansion, she looked back once through the stone archway. Dominic stood by the window, upright and unsteady, but standing. The ocean behind him caught the last of the sun, painting his silhouette in gold. Sophia whispered to herself, he's learning to stand again. She didn't realize she was learning too, to believe in something that wasn't supposed to happen, in someone who was supposed to be unreachable. And somewhere deep inside Dominic Santoro, a whisper echoed that would outlive the walls of that room. Too big, he murmured again, smiling faintly to himself. Just do it anyway. The mansion felt different that evening, quieter, more intimate, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Dominic had asked Sophia to stay for dinner, saying it was a thank you for helping him walk again. She almost said no, afraid of what people might think, afraid of crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But there was something in his eyes, not demand, but genuine request, that made refusal impossible. When she entered the dining room, the long table that usually looked like a war council had been stripped down to something startlingly simple. One pizza box still warm, two plates, candles flickering in empty wine bottles. No crystal, no silver, just honest simplicity. Dominic Santoro, the man who once hosted meetings where fortunes were decided and lives were ended, sat at the head of the table barefoot, wearing a simple black shirt, looking like someone trying to remember how to be human. She hesitated at the threshold. You really ordered pizza? He nodded, something almost sheepish in his expression. I didn't know what normal people eat together. This felt safe. She laughed softly, walking in. Safe is subjective in your world, I think. He poured her sparkling water as if it were the finest champagne, his movements deliberate and careful. For a while they ate in comfortable silence, the sound of the ocean crashing faintly outside the open terrace doors. Then he said, setting down his slice, I used to think power could buy peace. Turns out it only rents silence. Sophia looked at him closely, his hands strong but scarred, his eyes carrying a weariness that didn't belong to a man his age. You don't seem like someone who enjoys silence anymore, she observed. He met her gaze. Not since you started humming around the house. She smiled, the faintest blush coloring her cheeks. That's just habit. My mom used to say singing keeps the fear away. It works, he said simply. The candlelight made everything softer. His expression, his voice, the guarded heart he kept locked behind walls of stone and consequence. She asked quietly, what's it like being you? He thought for a long time before answering, his fingers tracing patterns on the table. Lonely. The world keeps telling you you're powerful until you start feeling guilty for being human. The accident made it worse. Everyone wanted the comeback story, not the truth. He paused, then continued, his voice dropping lower. I'm not the same. My body works differently. I don't even know if I can ever be with someone again, physically. Sophia's brow furrowed. You mean? He nodded, the admission hanging heavy in the air. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You think love is about performance, but maybe it's about presence. He blinked, caught off guard by her directness. She set down her slice and continued. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever love me too. People stare at my body before they listen to my words. They think softness means weakness. That size means something about worth. You hide behind power. I hide behind noise. But maybe we're both just afraid of being seen. Dominic's throat tightened. For the first time in years, someone had spoken straight through his armor, had seen past the reputation to the man beneath. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers gently. Sophia, he whispered, her name sounding different in his voice. Reverent, almost. She didn't pull away. The electricity between them was quiet but undeniable. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at air, as if afraid to move in case it all disappeared. You said once that everyone falls? he murmured. What if this is me falling? Then fall, she said softly. Just make sure it's forward. He laughed, but his voice trembled with something deeper than humor. They sat like that for what felt like hours, the storm of the outside world replaced by a fragile, sacred calm. Finally, she asked, tell me something true. He hesitated, then said quietly, I'm terrified. Of what? Of touching someone and not feeling enough, of being touched and being pitied. She squeezed his hand. Then let's make it not about that. When she stood and came around the table, he stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She knelt beside his chair so their eyes were level. You don't have to prove anything, Dominic. Just be here. Her hand came up to his face, thumb brushing the faint stubble along his jaw. His eyes closed instinctively, leaning into her touch like a man remembering what warmth felt like. It wasn't lust that filled the room. It was recognition. He reached for her hand, pressing it against his chest. Feel that? Still works. Sophia smiled, tears threatening but never falling. Then that's all that matters. He moved first, closing the space between them, his lips brushing hers, tentative, as if asking permission with every breath. She answered by deepening the kiss, slow and honest, and trembling with the weight of vulnerability finally shared. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, not from passion, but from the sheer gravity of letting someone in. I don't know how to do this, he whispered against her forehead. Me neither, she said, so let's learn together. They spent that night not as boss and maid, not as powerful and powerless, but as two people rediscovering what touch meant when it was given freely. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain starting again outside, the soft rhythm syncing with their hearts. When he kissed her again, it wasn't desperate. It was gentle, deliberate, like learning to walk one careful step at a time. His hands moved with care, hers with trust. They explored the distance between fear and tenderness until it disappeared entirely. Later, as they lay in the aftermath, neither spoke. The air was thick with something sacred. He stared at the ceiling, her head resting on his chest, feeling the faint thrum of life beneath his skin, proof that, despite everything, he was still alive. Do you regret this? He asked finally, his voice barely audible. She shook her head against him. No, I think this was always going to happen. Maybe the universe got tired of waiting for you to stand up. He smiled in the darkness, eyes closing. Maybe it sent you to make sure I did. Before sleep took them, she whispered into the quiet, thank you for letting me see you. His answer was a soft breath against her hair. Thank you for seeing me. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the ocean, the world kept spinning, unaware that a man who thought he was broken and a woman who thought she was too much had just rewritten what wholeness looked like. The morning after felt impossibly quiet, like the world was holding its breath before the storm. Dominic woke first, sunlight spilling through the heavy curtains in thin golden lines. Sophia slept beside him, her breathing soft and even, her face peaceful in a way that made his chest tighten. For the first time in years, he felt something simple and rare. Peace. He reached to touch her hair, but stopped midway, afraid to break the moment, afraid that movement would shatter whatever fragile thing they'd built in the darkness. Outside, gulls cried over the Atlantic, and the house seemed to exhale. But peace never lasts long for men like him. By noon, the whisper of disaster had already begun. Rocco appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Boss, we have a problem. Dominic sat up carefully, reaching for his shirt. What kind of problem? Security breach. Someone accessed the surveillance system 3 nights ago. They copied footage from the rehabilitation room. Dominic's blood went cold. What footage? Rocco's jaw tightened. You and the girl. It's been leaked. It's already spreading online. For a moment, the world tilted. Sophia stirred beside him, still half asleep, unaware that everything was about to change. Dominic's mind raced back to that night, the laughter, the clumsy encouragement over the balance ball, the way her voice had filled the room with light. And now, stripped of context, those words would sound like something else entirely. Who saw it? Dominic asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Everyone, Rocco said. It's everywhere, the media, the internet. They're calling it, he hesitated. Calling it what? The too big scandal. Dominic stood so fast his back screamed in protest, but he ignored it. Get it taken down and then now. We're trying, boss, but it's too late. There are hundreds of copies. Thousands. He didn't have time to process before his phone exploded with notifications, messages, calls, news alerts flooding in like a tsunami of judgment. His name, her name, twisted into clickbait and condemnation. Sophia heard the buzzing and sat up, confused. Dominic, what's... Then her own phone started ringing, and ringing, and ringing. At first she thought it was a mistake, some cruel prank. But when she opened Twitter, her world shattered into 1,000 pieces. Her photo, taken from the security feed, was plastered beside headlines that made her stomach turn. Powerful man caught with 19-year-old maid. Power and abuse in the Hamptons. The video was only 20 seconds long. Her nervous laughter sounded like submission. His whisper, stripped of meaning, sounded like command. She could see the comments even before she read them. She's after his money. Look at her. No wonder he kept her hidden. She seduced him for fame. Each word was a cut that bled her dry. Dominic called immediately, but she couldn't answer. Her voice would have broken. Her hands were shaking too hard. By afternoon, the story had hit every major network. Anonymous sources claimed misconduct. Fabricated testimonies appeared from people who'd never worked at the estate. His operations faced immediate scrutiny. When he finally reached her by phone, her voice was shaking. They're saying things about me, Dominic. About you. I can't even go outside. Don't, he said sharply, his voice carrying an edge that could cut stone. Stay there, I'll fix this. You can't, she whispered it. They think they're wrong. It doesn't matter, she said, her voice breaking. People believe what they want. His chest tightened with a rage he hadn't felt since the night someone tried to kill him. Come to the house. No, she said firmly. If I go back there, it'll only make it worse. They'll say you're protecting me because you're guilty. I am protecting you, he said. From what? She asked bitterly. The truth or the lies? Her voice cracked, and he had no answer that would fix this. When the call ended, he stared at the phone, feeling the world tilt beneath his feet the same way it had the night his car went off the road. Fire, metal, betrayal, and now her voice fading like smoke. That night, news vans parked outside his gates. Drones hovered over the estate. Headlines screamed of scandal and exploitation. Sophia's agency dropped her, citing moral violations. Her landlord slipped an eviction notice under her door due to media disturbance. She packed what little she had into a backpack and left under cover of darkness. Hood pulled low, moving through streets that felt hostile and hunting. Dominic tried to reach her again, but she didn't pick up. Meanwhile, Rocco stood in Dominic's study, arms crossed. The lawyers want you to issue a statement. Deny everything. Say she misled you. Dominic's voice was cold as winter steel. She didn't do anything wrong. Boss, if you don't distance yourself, this could destroy everything you've built. Then let it burn, Dominic said quietly, his eyes dark with something dangerous. I've rebuilt from ashes before. Rocco hesitated, then nodded once, understanding in the way only someone who'd stood beside him for decades could. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavier. The world had turned on him before. Rivals, enemies, prosecutors. But this felt different, because this time, someone innocent was caught in the crossfire. He opened his laptop. The video played again, distorted and cruel. The words that had been about courage now sounded alien, predatory. He shut it off, disgusted. Somewhere in Queens, Sophia sat on the floor of a cheap motel room, scrolling through comments she should never have read. Every insult echoed like truth she couldn't escape. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered to the empty room. But even she didn't believe it anymore. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dominic. Don't believe them. I'm fighting this. She stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision. She typed back, you can't fight the internet. But she didn't send it. Instead, she put the phone face down and cried quietly until dawn. At the mansion, Dominic sat by the dark window, watching lightning split the sea in jagged lines of white fire. His reflection stared back at him, tired, furious, and still standing. He whispered into the storm, a promise or a threat. "I'll fix this, Sophia. I swear I will." But he didn't know yet how. He only knew that whoever leaked that footage had made the worst mistake of their life. And Dominic Santoro had built his reputation on making sure mistakes were never repeated. Weeks passed, and the world showed no mercy. The scandal grew like wildfire, feeding on outrage and half-truths, until even people who'd never heard of Dominic Santoro had an opinion about him. Talk shows mocked the incident. Late-night comedians turned it into punchlines. The internet didn't want truth. It wanted entertainment, and nothing entertained quite like watching the powerful fall. Sophia disappeared into the noise of the city. She found work delivering food in Queens, wearing a cap low over her face, her phone pinging with orders while strangers whispered behind her back. Every time she caught her reflection in a store window, it felt like looking at someone the world had already convicted. She stopped answering Dominic's calls weeks ago, not from anger, but because every word with him hurt too much, reminded her too sharply of what they'd lost. One evening, as she handed an order to a customer, she saw her own face flash across a television screen inside the restaurant. The headline read, "The maid leaked messages confirm manipulation." Her breath caught. She stepped closer, horror mounting as she saw fake screenshots. AI-generated text showing her begging for money, manipulating him emotionally during his recovery. The anchor's voice dripped with false sympathy. Sources claim she targeted Mr. Santoro during his most vulnerable period. Sophia turned and ran outside as rain started to fall, her delivery bag soaking through, her chest burning. She leaned against a lamppost, whispering to herself through tears, "That's not me. That's not real." But no one was listening. Meanwhile, in the stone mansion that had once been her sanctuary, Dominic was discovering the rot inside his own world. The hacker had been traced, not an outsider, but someone within his inner circle. When Rocco slid the report across his desk, Dominic's hands went cold. "The leak came from Logan's access codes," Rocco said quietly. "Your assistant. He sold the footage to the tabloids for $50,000. He also supplied internal schedules and fabricated employee testimonies." Dominic felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. Logan, the man who'd been with him for years, who'd arranged Sophia's hiring, who'd stood in this very room offering advice. "Whitey." Dominic's voice was deadly quiet. Rocco hesitated. "Rival operation offered him a position. He said you were finished anyway. Thought he was securing his future." For a long moment, Dominic said nothing. Then he stood, the chair scraping against stone with a sound like judgment. "Get him," Dominic said. "Bring him here." Rocco nodded once and disappeared. When Logan was dragged into the study 3 hours later, pale and sweating, he couldn't meet Dominic's eyes. "Boss, I can explain." "Don't," Dominic interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You sold her name for $50,000. You fabricated lies that destroyed an innocent girl's life. For what? A job with people who'll betray you the moment you're no longer useful." Logan stammered, "I didn't think—" "No," Dominic said. "You didn't think about consequences, only profit." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room despite his cane. "You're done. Not just with me, with this city. If I ever hear your name again, it won't be in a courtroom. Do you understand?" Logan nodded frantically, understanding exactly what that meant. "Get out," Dominic said. After Logan was escorted out, and Dominic knew Rocco would make sure the message was clear, he stood alone in his study, staring at the walls that suddenly felt like a prison. He'd built an empire on loyalty bought with fear and money. But Sophia had given him something freely, and he'd already on it, boss. Because if there was one thing Dominic Santoro knew how to do, it was find what mattered. And Sofia Ramirez mattered more than anything he'd ever built. The next day, Dominic did something he hadn't done in years. He left the mansion himself. No drivers, no intermediaries. Just him, Rocco at the wheel, driving through rain-slicked streets toward Queens. One of Rocco's contacts had spotted Sophia delivering food near Roosevelt Avenue. When Dominic heard, he didn't hesitate. The car stopped outside a small diner, rain hammering the windshield. Through the fogged glass, he saw her, hair tucked under a cap, handing a customer a bag, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He opened the door and stepped out, cane in hand, rain soaking through his coat within seconds. Each step toward the diner felt like climbing a mountain, his body protesting, his heart hammering. When the door chimed and she looked up, the world went silent. She froze, eyes wide, disbelief flickering into something like fear. "Dominic," she breathed, "you shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," he said, his voice low and rough. "You told me to stand up again. I did, but I can't stand without you." A few customers looked over, recognizing him from the news. Phones came out, cameras started recording. But this time Dominic didn't care. He stepped closer, his hand trembling. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you sooner. I was scared of losing everything. But you were everything." Her lip quivered. "Dominic, they're filming. Let them," he said firmly. "They filmed our worst moment. Let them see the truth too." And right there in the middle of the diner, with rain pounding outside and cameras rolling, he took her hands in his. "You told me once that real doesn't need to be perfect," he said. "I finally understand that." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "You're insane." "Probably," he said, "but so is this." The crowd was silent now, the sound of rain and camera shutters blending into something that almost sounded like witnessing something sacred. Sophia looked at him, at the man who had everything and risked it all to give her back her name. And in that moment, she didn't care who was watching. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and he held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to break them both. The room erupted in camera flashes, but all Dominic felt was her warmth, her heartbeat steady against his chest. Proof the world hadn't won after all. The video from the diner exploded across every platform before midnight. For the first time since the scandal began, people stopped laughing and started listening. The raw footage showed Dominic Santoro, feared, powerful, untouchable, limping into a rain-soaked diner, pleading not with arrogance or wealth, but with vulnerability. "You told me to stand up again. I did, but I can't stand without you." The line became the most replayed moment on TikTok overnight, transforming into a symbol of accountability and genuine love. Millions shared it with captions like, "When powerful people own their humanity," and "Love that doesn't care about cameras." The internet that once devoured them began rebuilding them, pixel by pixel in empathy. Sophia woke the next morning to her phone buzzing with thousands of messages. Not hate this time, but hope. Women wrote that they believed her now, that they'd been misjudged too, that her courage gave them strength. She sat on the edge of her motel bed, crying quietly because she couldn't remember the last time people had spoken about her with kindness. Dominic's world, meanwhile, was in controlled chaos. Rocco reported that the rival operation behind Logan's betrayal had quietly withdrawn, sensing they'd miscalculated badly. When his remaining advisors demanded damage control, Dominic refused. "You can't fix what was never broken," he told them. "We were human, that's all." Then he issued one final statement across all channels, in his own words. "A woman's dignity is not collateral damage for profit. Her story deserves to be heard. The narrative ends here." The post went viral instantly. Days later, Dominic drove back to Queens in daylight this time. The diner owner greeted him with a knowing smile. "You're the guy from the rain." Dominic smiled faintly. Guilty. Sophia was restocking supplies in the back when she saw him through the glass door. She hesitated 1 second too long, then went to him. He looked healthier now, more grounded, still leaning on his cane, but no longer defeated by it. "You found me again," she said quietly. "I wasn't done proving you right," he replied. "About what?" "That real love doesn't care about headlines." He reached into his coat and handed her a folded document. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it carefully. "The charter for something new," he said. "A foundation. I'm calling it Real is Enough. It's for women who've been shamed, silenced, or slandered by lies." "You're going to run it?" She blinked, stunned. "Dominic, I'm not qualified to—" "You're qualified to survive," he interrupted gently. "And that's rarer than any degree." She opened the document fully and saw her name printed under director. Her throat closed. "You don't owe me this." "You're wrong," he said. "You taught me what honesty looks like when it costs everything." Now let me help you show others. The following month, they launched the foundation together. The first press conference was small, held in the same diner where they'd reunited. The crowd spilled onto the sidewalk as Sophia stepped up to speak, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. When they took my job, they called me a liar. When they took my name, they called me a scandal. But the truth is, they just couldn't believe someone like me deserved kindness without conditions. I'm not here to change their minds. I'm here to help the next girl who gets torn apart for being real. The applause was overwhelming. Dominic stood at the back, watching her shine, quiet pride warming his chest. Later, a reporter asked if she forgave him. She smiled softly. He never hurt me. The world did. He just helped me stand back up. That quote spread faster than the scandal ever had, printed on magazine covers, turned into murals across New York and Los Angeles. Real as Enough grew from a small office to a national network within 6 months. Scholarships, therapy, media defense for women whose stories were weaponized online. Dominic returned to his operations, but with different priorities. He handed control to people he actually trusted and focused on using his resources to protect rather than intimidate. Every headline that once cursed his name now called him a man who'd found redemption not through power, but through vulnerability. But for him, none of it mattered as much as the nights when he and Sophia sat together in her apartment above the foundation office, eating takeout and laughing about everything they'd survived. One evening she asked, "Do you ever wish the scandal never happened?" He thought about it carefully. If it hadn't, I might still be pretending I was alive instead of actually living. She leaned against his shoulder. Then maybe it wasn't a scandal. Maybe it was a restart. He smiled, brushing his thumb along her hand. Maybe it was fate dressed as chaos. Outside, the city pulsed with indifferent life. The world had moved on, but they hadn't. They'd found something worth staying still for. A year later, the world no longer whispered scandal when it said their names. Instead, it spoke of rebirth, of second chances earned rather than given. Real as Enough had become a movement. Murals of Sophia appeared in cities nationwide, her face framed with the words, "Real as Enough," painted boldly across brick walls. She'd accepted one interview, a quiet sit-down for a major magazine, beside Dominic, who now walked with only the faint reminder of his cane, more symbol than necessity. The interviewer asked what everyone wanted to know. "You've both rebuilt your lives, your reputations. What changed?" Sophia glanced at Dominic before answering. "We stopped trying to be who people expected. We started being who we needed." Dominic nodded. "Redemption isn't rewriting your story. It's reading it out loud, even the ugly parts, and not flinching." The article broke records because it was honest. Later that month, they hosted their first scholarship gala for young women overcoming public shaming. Sophia wore a simple dress, no diamonds, just herself, radiant in truth. When she walked onto the stage, Dominic watched from the side, pride swelling quietly. She began without notes. "They once said I was too young, too soft, too much. They said my story was over before it began, but I stand here not as a victim, not as a headline, but as proof that the world cannot define you without your consent." The room erupted in applause that lasted minutes. Dominic stepped onto the stage beside her, whispering just loud enough for her to hear, "You were born for this." She smiled, whispering back, "No, we were reborn for this." The next morning, clips of her speech trended globally under hashtag The Rebirth. But beyond headlines, their lives had grown quieter, fuller. They'd moved to a small house in Malibu, mornings with ocean air, evenings with laughter over burnt attempts at cooking. Dominic mentored people rebuilding from nothing. Sophia ran workshops for girls learning to find their voices again. One afternoon, as the tide came in, Sophia sat on the sand sketching ideas for a children's book. Dominic approached from behind, footsteps uneven but confident. "Writing something new?" he asked. She nodded. "A story about a girl who learns she's enough even when people tell her otherwise." "Sounds familiar," he said, sitting beside her. "Maybe," she teased, "but this time no scandals, just truth." He smiled, letting the surf touch their feet. "You know, men still write asking how your story changed them. They say they're learning to listen now." She turned to him. "And what about you? What did my story change in you?" He thought carefully. It made me realize I was never paralyzed from the waist down. I was paralyzed from the heart out. She reached for his hand. Not anymore. He looked at her, sunlight reflecting in her eyes, and saw not the maid who'd entered his world years ago, but the woman who'd rebuilt what strength meant. That night, they watched the sun marching together. Sophia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how it started?" she asked. He chuckled. "Every time someone says the words too big, I try not to smile." She laughed. "Who would have thought that sentence would lead us here?" "Fate," he said, with a twisted sense of humor. She turned to him. "Promise me something. Anything. No matter what happens next, we stay real." He kissed her hand. "Always." Stars emerged above them, quiet witnesses. When dawn came, it felt not like another day, but the continuation of something sacred. Two people who'd fallen, burned, and rebuilt themselves into something stronger than forgiveness. 2 years later, the world had moved on. But their love deepened in silence, away from cameras. The Malibu house had become home. Sophia sat at her desk finishing her memoir, What Real Looks Like. The foundation thrived internationally, but today no cameras, just salt air, coffee, and life rebuilt from ruins. Dominic appeared in the doorway. "Ready?" She looked up, smiling. "I've been ready for 2 years." Outside, lanterns swung in the wind. A small gathering of friends and girls from the program waited. They'd married months ago, quietly, in a courthouse, but tonight was celebration of what came after vows, the living part of love. Sophia stood barefoot in linen, Dominic barefoot too because he said shoes felt dishonest now. Sunset bled gold across the ocean. When they reached the center of the deck, she turned to him. "2 years ago, we were memes. Now look at us," he chuckled. "Still viral, but for the right reasons." She took his hand. "Do you think about that night?" "Every day," he said. "Not because of what the world saw, but what I felt. You looked at me like I wasn't broken. That's because you never were. You just forgot." He pulled her close. "Still too big?" he asked with a smile. She laughed through tears. "No, just big enough to hold everything I love." Gentle applause followed, the kind that comes from hearts that understand. Hours later, after everyone left, they sat under lanterns glowing against the dark sky. Sophia leaned back against his chest, watching the tide. "The internet thinks it made us famous." He smiled. "Let them think that. We know the truth." Which is? Love doesn't need publicity. It just survives everything fake. She turned and kissed him, slow and grateful. Inside, her book sat open, cursor blinking at the final line. Later, she typed without hesitation. They tried to make her a meme. They turned him into a headline. But love has no algorithm. It just survives everything fake. She hit save, then returned to the deck where he watched stars. "What does real look like?" she murmured. "Exactly this," he replied. Waves crashed, wind carried ocean salt, candle smoke drifted upward. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was real. And as they held each other beneath the quiet sky, the universe that once seemed cruel now felt small and kind, as if it too believed redemption was just another word for love that refused to die.